When I was in high school, I was what most people would have called a nerd. Back then, that wasn't the harmless label it can be today. These days, I hear people wear the word like a badge of honor. For me and my friends, it felt more like a target painted on our backs. High school was different then. You could get picked on for almost anything. Liking the wrong music, not playing sports, spending your lunch break in the library instead of on the field. It sounds cliché now, but that's honestly how it was. Looking back, junior year was probably the worst of it. Most of that misery came from one person. Steve. Steve seemed to enjoy making other people's lives difficult. He spent most of the year tormenting us, and the more attention he got from it, the worse he became. By the end of the school year, he decided he wanted to pull one final stunt, something big enough to cement his reputation as the school's troublemaker. Before I get into that, I should probably explain a little about the school itself. The school has since been closed, but back then it was one of the more well-known private schools in the area. We wore uniforms, attended church services during school hours, and spent our days inside a building that looked every bit as old as it actually was. According to local stories, the property had originally been some kind of hospital decades before it became a school. I remember hearing that when construction crews renovated the grounds in the 1950s, they uncovered skeletal remains buried beneath the property. Supposedly, many belonged to tuberculosis patients. One story claimed there had once been an underground tunnel connecting the hospital to another building, and that bodies were transported through it during outbreaks. Whether any of that was true, I honestly don't know. What I do know is that those stories spread through the town for generations. Every class seemed to inherit them from the students before. By the time I attended the school, they had become something between local folklore and urban legend, and the building certainly didn't help. The place always felt unsettling. Long hallways echoed when nobody was walking through them. Pipes rattled inside the walls. Floors creaked for no apparent reason. Sometimes you'd hear strange sounds late in the day, when most classrooms were empty. Logically, it was probably just an aging building settling and groaning under its own weight. Still, when you're a teenager sitting in a 100-year-old hallway after sunset, logic doesn't always win. Rumors of hauntings were everywhere. People talked about restless spirits, shadow figures, and voices heard in empty rooms. Most of us laughed about it. But there was always that tiny part of your brain that wondered, what if? Anyway, back to Steve. His grand plan was to break into the school after hours and stage some kind of elaborate supernatural prank. Somehow, he managed to get inside. Once there, he started trashing classrooms, scattering papers across floors, overturning supplies, and pulling books from shelves in the library. The goal, apparently, was to make it look as though something paranormal had torn through the building. To finish the act, he broke into the art room, grabbed red paint, and began writing messages across the lockers. Typical horror movie stuff. Get out. Your soul is next. Death is coming. The kind of thing that probably sounded terrifying in his head. What happened next is where the story gets strange. While painting one of the messages, Steve later claimed he heard something coming from the basement level of the school. At first, he assumed it was just another noise from the old building. But according to him, it kept happening. He walked toward the basement door to investigate. Before he even started down the stairs, he said he noticed movement below. Not a person exactly. Shadows, shapes shifting in the darkness. Then he heard voices, not clear words, not a conversation he could understand. just multiple voices speaking somewhere below him. Now, this is Steve's version of events, and even back then I wasn't sure how much I believed. Part of me thought he was exaggerating to make his prank sound more dramatic after he got caught. But Steve wasn't the type to admit fear. That's what always stuck with me. He loved attention, sure, but he hated looking weak. According to him, the voices sounded wrong somehow. He couldn't explain it very well. He said they didn't sound like ordinary whispers. They sounded angry, hostile, almost as if whoever or whatever was down there knew he was standing at the top of the stairs listening. That was the moment he ran. Not walked, not backed away. Ran. He left the building and never finished his prank. Of course, none of that helped him avoid getting caught. It didn't take long for school administrators to match his handwriting to the messages painted on the lockers. The red paint, the vandalized classrooms, and the fake ghost warnings all led straight back to him. But even after he admitted everything else, Steve never changed his story about what he heard in that basement. And whether he was lying, mistaken, or telling the truth. I can still remember the look on his face when he talked about it. For the first time all year, Steve genuinely looked scared. The school had finally had enough of Steve. After the investigation, he was expelled that same week. I'll never forget the scene. As he was being escorted out of the office, he was screaming at anyone who would listen, ranting about something evil living in the basement. Those were his words, not mine. At the time, I didn't believe a single word of it. Honestly, I thought he was doing whatever he could to save himself. Steve was the kind of person who always needed attention, and it seemed entirely possible that he had invented the whole story in hopes that people would feel sorry for him. Unfortunately, it worked. Everyone suddenly treated him like some kind of hero. People whispered about how brave he had been. Some students even claimed he was lucky to be alive. Looking back, it's still ridiculous to me. They genuinely believed Steve had encountered evil spirits. My friends and I weren't exactly mourning his departure. We'd spent an entire year dealing with his bullying. As far as we were concerned, he got exactly what he deserved. Still, for the final weeks of school, we couldn't escape hearing people talk about him. Every conversation seemed to circle back to Steve and the basement. Eventually, on the last day of school, I got tired of it. I remember sitting with my friends and saying something that, in hindsight, was probably a terrible idea. What if we just go down there ourselves? The table went quiet. My idea was simple. We'd sneak into the school after dark, go straight to the basement, prove it was just an ordinary basement, and finally put all the ghost stories to rest. No spirits, no demons, no haunted tunnels, and most importantly, proof that Steve was a lying punk. To my surprise, everyone agreed. The plan wasn't complicated. We'd get in, head downstairs, spend a few minutes looking around, and leave. If we heard anything strange, we'd run. No questions asked. The biggest challenge wasn't the basement. It was avoiding getting caught. Unlike Steve, we weren't exactly known for causing trouble. We were the nerds, the teachers' pets, the kids who actually enjoyed learning. Nobody would have believed we'd break into our own school. Maybe that was why we felt confident. I remember the night vividly. For an early summer evening, it was surprisingly cold. We all wore sweatpants, jackets, and hoodies. Looking back, we probably looked ridiculous, like kids pretending to be criminals in a low-budget movie. At the time, though, it felt serious. Every sound seemed louder than normal. Every shadow seemed deeper. Breaking in turned out to be easier than expected, not because we were master thieves, but because Carson's mom worked as a janitor at the school and had access to a key. That was honestly half the reason we decided to go through with it. Carson had borrowed the key, and a few minutes later we were slipping through a rear entrance and into the building. The moment the door closed behind us, the atmosphere changed. I've talked to other people about this over the years, and most of them agree. Schools feel completely different after dark. During the day, they're full of noise, conversations, and movement. At night, they're hollow, silent, almost abandoned. Every hallway suddenly feels longer than you remember. Every classroom seems darker. Maybe it's psychological. Maybe our brains aren't used to seeing familiar places emptied of people. Or maybe it was years of hearing ghost stories about the school. Whatever the reason, I felt uneasy almost immediately. I tried not to show it. Eventually, we reached the basement door, and that's when I realized I was actually nervous. Not terrified, not enough to turn around, but nervous. I remember standing there thinking about Steve's story. For weeks I'd mocked him and called him a liar. Yet now that I was standing in front of the same door he'd described, I couldn't completely ignore the possibility that something unexpected might be waiting downstairs. I kept those thoughts to myself. I didn't want my friends making fun of me. Besides, we'd already come this far. Turning around would have felt worse than going forward. Carson opened the door. Nothing. No voices. No shadows. Just a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Carson went first. The rest of us followed. Cell phones weren't common back then, and even if you had one, it definitely didn't have a flashlight. We were using cheap dollar store flashlights that barely seemed strong enough to cut through the darkness. The deeper we went, the colder the air felt. At the bottom was exactly what you'd expect from the basement of an ancient building. Dust, storage boxes, old shelves, the smell of age and neglect. As we explored, we peeked inside some of the boxes. Most contained completely ordinary things. Old textbooks, Christmas decorations, extra school uniforms, and random supplies nobody had touched in years. Nothing supernatural, nothing unusual. And yet, the place still bothered me. The strangest part wasn't the darkness or the silence. It was the statues. Scattered throughout parts of the basement were old religious statues that had apparently been stored there decades earlier. Maybe it's just me, but those things have always unsettled me. There's something eerie about old religious figures sitting motionless in the dark. The flashlight beams would catch their faces unexpectedly, making them seem almost alive for a split second. Every time it happened, my heart would jump. I kept telling myself it was stupid. They were statues, nothing more. Still, I found myself checking twice whenever one appeared at the edge of my flashlight beam. We spent several more minutes exploring. And for a while, it seemed like our trip was going to prove exactly what we'd come there to prove. That Steve had lied. That the basement was nothing more than an old storage area beneath an aging school. Then something happened that made me start questioning that assumption. We never found any ghosts. What we did find was that the basement was far larger than any of us expected. It seemed to stretch endlessly beneath the school. Even standing in the middle of it, our flashlights couldn't reach the far walls. I know they were cheap flashlights, but it still felt wrong somehow. The darkness didn't just seem deep, it felt consuming, as if it swallowed the light before it could travel very far. The deeper we explored, the quieter things became. At some point, we reached one of the far corners of the basement. I remember noticing that the air felt colder there. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it was because that section had been sealed off from the rest of the building for years. Whatever the reason, none of us liked being there. A stack of old boxes had been piled against the wall. Out of curiosity, we started moving them aside. That's when we found it. A hole. At first, I thought it was just damage in the wall, but as more of it became visible, we realized it was intentional. It was roughly the size of a large beach ball, small, but definitely large enough for someone to crawl through. Carson immediately wanted to investigate. The rest of us weren't nearly as enthusiastic. We aimed our flashlights through the opening, but the beam disappeared into darkness. All we could really make out was what looked like a narrow tunnel extending beyond the wall. Without anyone saying it aloud, we all reached the same conclusion. This had to be connected to the old stories. The tunnel. The one people claimed had once been used by the hospital decades earlier. Suddenly, all those rumors we'd laughed about didn't seem quite so funny. Carson argued that if we were serious about proving there were no ghosts, we couldn't ignore the one place everyone would point to afterward. As much as I hated admitting it, he had a point. So we settled it the only way teenagers can. Rock, paper, scissors. I lost. The second my friends started laughing, I knew there was no backing out. I dropped to my hands and knees and began crawling into the tunnel. The darkness felt different in there. The basement had been creepy, but at least it was open. The tunnel felt claustrophobic. Every movement echoed. Every scrape of clothing against the dirt sounded too loud. I had only crawled a short distance when I heard something. I froze. At first, I assumed it was my imagination. Behind me, I could hear my friends laughing because I'd already stopped. "Shut up," I whispered. The laughter faded. I listened. There it was again. Some kind of sound deeper in the tunnel. The best way I can describe it is a whooshing noise, not wind. At least, it didn't sound like wind. It almost sounded rhythmic. Breathing, maybe, though even now I'm not sure that's accurate. I remember feeling my stomach tighten. Every logical part of my brain was trying to come up with an explanation. Airflow, water, an animal, anything. I shouted into the darkness. "Hello?" The sound stopped. For a second, everything was silent. Then the whooshing changed. It became something else, a whisper. Faint at first. So faint I wasn't even sure I was hearing it. I called out again. "Is someone there?" The whispering continued, and somehow it seemed closer. Louder, not loud enough to understand words. Just enough to know it was there. Then, without warning, it stopped completely. The silence that followed felt worse. Behind me, my friends were asking what was taking so long. I couldn't answer. I just sat there staring into the darkness ahead, waiting for my flashlight to reveal something that would explain what I was hearing. Finally, I crawled forward. Only a few feet. And then my flashlight found something. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. There was someone in the tunnel, maybe 15 feet ahead, squatting, completely motionless, watching me. I remember feeling every hair on my arms stand up. The person looked impossibly thin. No shirt. Skin stretched tightly over visible ribs. Their posture looked unnatural, almost animal-like. For a moment, I genuinely wondered if I was looking at a corpse. Then I realized they were staring directly at me. I shouted. The figure didn't react. It just continued watching. The expression on its face is what stayed with me. Not anger, not fear, just this vacant, half-open stare that felt completely wrong. I asked if they were okay. Nothing. No response. No movement. Somehow that scared me more than if they had spoken. Every instinct in my body was telling me to get away. Slowly, I started crawling backward. The second I moved, the figure moved too. It lunged forward, not standing up, not running. It surged toward me in that same crouched position. And then it made a sound. To this day, I struggled to describe it. It wasn't a scream, it wasn't a growl. It sounded almost human, but not quite. Like someone trying to imitate a human voice and getting it wrong. I've had nightmares about that sound. Trying to crawl backward while keeping my eyes on that thing was one of the most terrifying moments of my life. I remember scraping my elbows against the tunnel floor, desperately trying to move faster. Behind me, my friends were still confused. Then I burst out of the opening, and they saw it too. The figure crawled out of the tunnel right behind me. For a split second, it stood partially in the flashlight beams, and every one of us froze. It looked even worse outside the tunnel. Thin, filthy, wild. Then it reached toward me. That was enough. We ran. None of us said a word. We sprinted through the basement, up the stairs, and toward the exit. I could hear movement behind us. I could hear that strange noise echoing through the darkness. But I never looked back. I couldn't. By the time we reached the top of the stairs and slammed the basement doors shut, the sounds had stopped getting closer. It never came upstairs. At least, I don't think it did. We ran from the school and all the way back to my house. For hours we sat there trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Even now, decades later, I still don't believe it was a ghost. I've always searched for a logical explanation. The tunnel probably connected to something else, a sewer system, an abandoned utility passage, maybe another structure entirely. My best guess has always been that the person was homeless and had found shelter somewhere beneath the school. That explanation makes sense, at least on paper. And honestly, it's the explanation I still choose to believe. But there's one detail that has never sat right with me. The eyes. I've met thousands of people since that night. I've seen fear, anger, exhaustion, addiction, and mental illness. But I have never seen eyes like those. They looked empty and intensely aware at the same time, like the person was staring straight through me, as if they had been sitting in that darkness for a very long time, waiting. The school eventually shut down years later. When I heard the news, my mind immediately went back to that tunnel. I wondered whether it was still there, whether anyone ever found where it led, whether anyone ever found the person we encountered. Most days I believed there was a rational explanation. Most days. But every now and then, usually late at night, I find myself remembering those eyes. And for a moment, I'm not nearly as certain as I used to be. Last year, I got my first real long-term assignment as a substitute teacher. Before that, I had spent years bouncing between schools all over the area, sometimes covering a single class and sometimes filling in for a few days at a time. In April of last year, though, an opportunity came along that felt different. One of the history teachers at a school where I frequently worked went on maternity leave. She would be gone from April through the end of the school year in late June, and I was asked to take over several of her classes. Honestly, I loved it. Substitute teaching can be unpredictable. Some schools are wonderful. Others can make you question every life choice that brought you there. In this case, I was teaching high school seniors. By April, most seniors have already mentally graduated. The phenomenon is usually called senioritis, Assignments become optional in their minds. Deadlines become suggestions. The countdown to summer becomes more important than anything happening in class. I knew fighting that attitude would be pointless. Instead of burying them in lectures and endless note-taking, I tried to keep things engaging. At that point in the curriculum, we were discussing government and civic issues, so I focused heavily on discussions and debates. I encouraged students to disagree respectfully, to listen, to defend their ideas without attacking each other. Some people might think that sounds controversial, but it worked surprisingly well. Many of the students became genuinely invested in the conversations. Before I knew it, finals had arrived. Then finals were over, and suddenly summer vacation was right around the corner. The last day of school was a half day, as usual. There was an award ceremony in the morning, and afterward the building slowly began to empty. Students wandered through the halls saying their final goodbyes. Seniors hugged friends they might never see again. Teachers signed yearbooks. The atmosphere felt strangely emotional, like everyone understood that a chapter of their lives was ending. Eventually, I returned to my classroom and started cleaning. I wanted everything organized before leaving for the summer. The teacher I was replacing had trusted me with her classroom for months, and I wanted to leave it exactly as I'd found it. Maybe even better. I was nearly finished when the principal stopped by. He noticed I was still working and asked if I had a few minutes to talk. That conversation ended up lasting almost an hour. We walked through the mostly empty building discussing my future. To my surprise, he told me he had been impressed with my work and wanted to find a way to bring me back in the fall. I can't adequately describe how excited that made me. Anyone who works as a substitute teacher knows how uncertain the job can be. For the first time, it felt like I might actually have a future there. Eventually, we reached the front of the building and prepared to leave. That's when I realized I'd forgotten my purse in the classroom. I said goodbye to the principal and headed back inside. By then, the school felt completely different. A few hours earlier, the hallways had been packed with students. Now they were nearly silent. Most of the classrooms were dark. The distant sounds of people talking echoed through empty corridors. I remember thinking how strange schools feel when they're almost empty. Not scary exactly, just off. As I approached my classroom, I was already thinking about what I needed to do before heading home. Then I stepped inside and froze. Standing beside my desk was one of my students. I'll call him Ben. Ben was one of the brightest students I'd taught all year. Quiet, respectful, exceptionally intelligent. The type of student who rarely caused problems and usually preferred to stay in the background. Seeing him there caught me completely off guard. For a second, I genuinely wondered if I'd walked into the wrong classroom. Ben? He looked at me, then shrugged. That was it. No explanation, no greeting, nothing. I tried again. What are you doing here? Another shrug. The whole interaction felt oddly awkward, not threatening, just strange. I asked if he was okay. After a long pause, he quietly replied that he was fine and was just thinking. Something about the way he said it made me uncomfortable. I couldn't have explained why. Looking back, maybe it was because his answer didn't really answer the question, or maybe it was because of how empty the school had become. A student standing alone in an abandoned classroom after everyone else had gone home simply wasn't something I expected to see. I told him that the school day was over and that he needed to head home. As soon as the words left my mouth, I found myself worrying about whether I was handling the situation correctly. I hadn't been teaching long enough to know what the proper procedure was. Part of me felt bad. What if something was wrong? What if he genuinely needed someone to talk to? At the same time, I knew I couldn't just leave him alone in the building. The entire situation felt uncomfortable in a way I couldn't quite define. Thankfully, Ben nodded and began walking toward the door. I immediately felt relieved. The tension I'd been feeling started to disappear. Maybe it had all just been awkward timing. Maybe he really had been sitting there thinking. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Then he reached the doorway and stopped. He didn't turn around, didn't look at me. He simply stood there facing the hallway. For several seconds, neither of us said anything. Then, in a quiet voice, he spoke. "Thank you." I waited for him to continue. When he did, the words sounded perfectly normal. "I'm sure I'll see you around." On paper, there was nothing strange about that sentence. I've replayed it in my head countless times since then, and the words themselves weren't unusual. It was the delivery, the tone, the way he said it. Something about it felt wrong, not threatening, not angry, just unsettling. As though there was some meaning behind the words that I wasn't understanding. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe the empty building had put me on edge. Maybe I was simply exhausted after a long school year. I don't know. What I do know is that the moment he walked away, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I watched him disappear down the hallway. Then I turned back toward my desk. All I wanted to do was grab my purse and finally go home. At that point, I had no idea that my interaction with Ben wasn't over. I walked over to my desk and immediately noticed something strange. I always kept my purse inside one of the desk drawers. Always. It was a habit I'd developed years ago. But now my purse was sitting on the chair beside my desk. The moment I saw it, my stomach dropped. My first thought was Ben. Who else could have moved it? I quickly opened the purse and started checking everything inside. My wallet was there. My keys were there. Nothing appeared to be missing. Even the cash inside my wallet was untouched. That only confused me more. If Ben had opened my purse, why hadn't he taken anything? The only explanation I could come up with was that he'd intended to steal something and changed his mind. Maybe guilt got the better of him. Maybe he'd heard me returning to the classroom and panicked. At the time, that explanation seemed reasonable enough. Looking back, I wish I'd thought harder about it. A few nights later, my husband and I were sitting outside enjoying one of those perfect summer evenings. The air was warm. The sky was clear. We had a small fire going in the backyard and were enjoying the rare opportunity to have the house to ourselves. Our 7-year-old son was spending the weekend with his cousin, so for once everything felt quiet, peaceful, normal. At some point during the evening, we heard a rustling sound coming from behind our shed. It wasn't especially loud, just enough to catch our attention. My husband immediately looked toward the noise. I told him it was probably a raccoon, a squirrel, or some other animal. We lived in an area where that kind of thing happened all the time. As far as I was concerned, it wasn't worth worrying about. The sound eventually stopped, and we went back to enjoying the fire. Around midnight, we decided to head inside. Just before we went in, my husband said he wanted to check around the shed. I laughed and told him not to get sprayed by a skunk. Then I went inside. A few minutes later, while getting ready for bed, I realized he still hadn't come in. When I went downstairs, he was just coming through the back door. He looked thoughtful, a little uneasy. He told me that when he first checked behind the shed, he hadn't found anything. But when he walked around to the front, he noticed the shed door was slightly open. Not wide open, just enough to make him stop and wonder if he'd forgotten to close it earlier. Inside, he thought he saw muddy footprints. Then behind the shed, he noticed marks in the soft ground that looked like someone had stepped there. The more he talked, the less certain he sounded. Eventually, he admitted he wasn't even sure if what he'd seen was real. Maybe he was just connecting random details together because the rustling sound had put him on edge. I wasn't particularly concerned. Honestly, I figured he'd accidentally left the shed open and was now overthinking it. The next morning, I woke up before him. As I headed downstairs to make coffee, I noticed something else. The back door was slightly open. Not enough to be obvious. Just barely ajar. The kind of thing you might miss if you weren't paying attention. I immediately assumed my husband had forgotten to shut it properly after checking the shed. I closed it, locked it, and moved on with my day. Now, looking back, I wish I hadn't been so quick to dismiss these things. That night, my husband stayed up late watching a baseball game. I tried to stay awake with him, but eventually fell asleep on the couch. When the game ended, he woke me up and we headed upstairs. Once I got into bed, though, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, adjusted my pillow, changed positions. Nothing helped. It wasn't anxiety, exactly. At least I didn't think it was. Something just felt off. A feeling I couldn't explain. After nearly an hour of staring at the ceiling, I finally decided to go downstairs and read. I quietly slipped out of the bedroom so I wouldn't wake my husband. The hallway was dark, silent. The only light came from a small nightlight near the stairs. I had barely taken a few steps when I froze. Someone was standing at the end of the hallway. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. It was just a dark silhouette, motionless, watching, every muscle in my body locked up. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just stood there staring. My first thought was that I was still half asleep. My second thought was much worse. Slowly, without taking my eyes off the figure, I reached for the hallway light switch. The second the light came on, my heart nearly stopped. Standing outside my son's bedroom was Ben, my student. The same quiet student from the classroom, the same student who had been standing beside my desk on the last day of school. For a moment, I genuinely couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. My mind kept searching for another explanation. A mistake, a dream, anything. But there he was, standing in my hallway, inside my house. Ben smiled, calmly, almost casually. "Hey, Miss Jones," he said. Then he looked around. Nice house. The way he said it terrified me. Not because he was yelling. Not because he sounded angry. Because he sounded completely comfortable. As if he belonged there. As if being inside my home in the middle of the night was perfectly normal. I noticed he was holding something in one hand. From where I stood, I couldn't tell what it was. That uncertainty made everything worse. I didn't wait to find out. The survival part of my brain finally kicked in. I spun around and ran back to the bedroom. I grabbed my phone and called 911. At the same time, I woke my husband and tried to explain what was happening. The second he understood, he sprinted into the hallway. I followed behind him only far enough to see him rush toward our son's room. By then, Ben had already gone inside. My husband threw open the door, and everything happened at once. Ben was climbing through the bedroom window. My husband tried to grab him. For a moment, it looked like he might actually catch him. Then Ben slipped free and jumped. The room was on the second floor. I expected to hear a scream, a crash, something. Instead, he hit the ground, landed on his feet, and immediately started running. My husband rushed to the window, but by then Ben was already disappearing into the darkness. Neither of us chased him. We stayed inside and waited for the police. I remember sitting there shaking uncontrollably. Not because he had broken into the house, not because he'd been standing in the hallway, not even because he'd entered my son's room. The thing that terrified me most was a single question. How long had he known where we lived? Because suddenly the moved purse, the strange goodbye, the rustling behind the shed, the muddy footprints, and the open back door all seemed connected. And for the first time, I began to wonder if Ben had been watching us long before I ever saw him standing in that hallway. When the police arrived, I immediately told them who I believed the intruder was. Ben, my student. The same student I'd found standing in my classroom on the last day of school. The officers took the information seriously and followed up that night. They went to Ben's house. They spoke with his parents. And that's where everything became even more frustrating. According to his parents, Ben had been home all evening. When the officers spoke to Ben himself, he calmly told them he'd been asleep for hours. Just like that, he had an alibi. I remember sitting there listening to the updates and feeling completely helpless. It felt absurd. I knew what I'd seen. I wasn't guessing. I wasn't confused. I hadn't seen someone who merely resembled him. He had been standing in my hallway, inside my home, looking directly at me. Yet because there wasn't enough evidence to prove it, the police couldn't do much. The officers were polite and professional, but the message was essentially the same. If something happens again, call us immediately. Until then, there wasn't much they could do. I understood their position, at least logically. Emotionally, though, it was infuriating. Someone had entered my house. Someone had been standing outside my son's bedroom, and somehow I was expected to simply go back to living my life. The rest of that summer was miserable. I rarely went outside unless I absolutely had to. Every unfamiliar car made me nervous. Every unexpected sound caught my attention. Every movement outside a window forced me to stop and look. I changed every lock in the house, installed cameras around the property, added motion lights, anything that made me feel even slightly safer. My husband eventually suggested something that suddenly made a lot of sense. He thought Ben may have gotten our address from my driver's license. The license was inside my purse. The same purse he'd apparently gone through at school. The same purse I found sitting outside the drawer where I always kept it. For the first time, all those pieces seemed to fit together. And somehow, that realization made me feel worse. Because if that was true, it meant he hadn't randomly found our house. He had deliberately looked for it, deliberately come there, deliberately entered it. What still makes me sick to think about isn't the hallway. It isn't the shed. It isn't even seeing him in the house. It's the fact that he walked into my son's bedroom. I still don't know why. I don't know what he intended to do. I don't know what he was holding in his hand. And I don't know what might have happened if I hadn't gotten out of bed that night. Those questions have haunted me far more than any answers ever could. For most of that summer, my son spent a lot of time staying with his cousin. Officially, it was because they enjoyed being together. The truth was more complicated. I was terrified. Terrified of letting him sleep in that room. Terrified of waking up one night and finding someone inside the house again. When he's older, I'll tell him the full story. For now, I'd rather let him enjoy his childhood without knowing how close he may have come to something terrible. The strangest part is that none of this matches the person I thought I knew. Ben was never disruptive, never disrespectful, never threatening. He was intelligent, quiet, polite, the kind of student teachers often describe as a pleasure to have in class. Nothing about him suggested this. Nothing. Even now, I struggle to reconcile those two versions of him. The student I taught, and the person standing in my hallway. As I'm writing this, I still don't know where Ben is. Thankfully, there has never been another incident. No messages, no sightings, no unexplained visits, nothing. And yet, despite the years that have passed, I still think about that night more often than I'd like to admit, especially one detail, that feeling, the reason I got out of bed. I wasn't hearing a noise. I hadn't seen anything. There was no obvious reason to wake up. Something simply felt wrong. For years, I'd heard people talk about intuition, about instincts, about mothers somehow knowing when something wasn't right. I'd always assumed it was an exaggeration. Until that night. Because if I had stayed in bed even 10 seconds longer, I probably never would have seen Ben standing in that hallway. And that thought still chills me. These days, our house is on the market. We're hoping to move soon. Some people might think that's an overreaction. Maybe it is. But every room in that house reminds me of what happened. Every creak in the floorboards, every shadow in the hallway, every glance toward my son's bedroom door. I don't need a larger house. I don't need a better neighborhood. What I need is a place that doesn't carry those memories. A place where every strange sound isn't immediately followed by fear. A place where I don't find myself checking the locks one last time before bed. And maybe when we're finally gone, I'll be able to do something I haven't done in a very long time. Get a full night's sleep. As great as the end of the school year always felt, the real reward came afterward. The parties. There was just something special about that first weekend home after a year away at college. Everyone came back with new stories, new friends, and usually a slightly worse sense of judgment than when they had left. After high school, my friend group ended up scattered all over the place. Some stayed close to home, while others ended up several states away. I was one of those people. My college was nearly 8 hours from where I grew up, and by the time finals ended, I felt like I hadn't seen my friends in forever. I couldn't wait to get home, not just to see everyone again, but to celebrate. For weeks, we'd been talking about throwing a huge party at my friend Logan's house. His parents owned this massive place in the middle of nowhere. It had everything you could possibly want for a college reunion party. A pool, a giant backyard, a bonfire pit, and more couches, spare rooms, and floor space than anyone could ever need. The timing couldn't have been better. His parents were going out of town the exact weekend everyone would be home. It felt like the universe was practically handing us an opportunity to make terrible decisions. Before the party, a few of us met up with Logan to catch up. We wandered around the mall, grabbed food, and spent hours talking about college. Or at least that's what we'd tell our parents. In reality, most of the conversation revolved around parties. Who had the craziest dorm stories? Who got kicked out of what frat house? Who woke up somewhere they definitely weren't supposed to be? The usual college nonsense. At some point, we started discussing ways to make the upcoming party even bigger. That's when Logan suggested something completely random. Let's make it a costume party. At first, it sounded ridiculous. It was the end of May. Halloween was months away. But the more we talked about it, the more it made sense. Most of us had spent Halloween on our respective campuses, so this could be our unofficial second Halloween. The idea spread quickly. We started messaging people, posting about it online, and telling everyone to throw together a costume if they could find one on short notice. To my surprise, people loved it. Even the people who normally complained about everything seemed excited. Our Halloween decorations ended up being embarrassingly minimal. We found a few bags of candy corn at a grocery store and basically called it good enough. Nobody cared. The costumes were the real attraction. Most of us threw together whatever we could find at the last minute. I dug an old Jason hockey mask out of my parents' basement and decided to go as Casey Jones. Good enough. Around 10 that night, people started arriving. Then more people arrived. Then even more. Within an hour, the house felt completely different. Music echoed through every room. People were swimming. People were dancing. People were drinking far more than they should have been. At the time, the Purge movies were relatively new, so a surprising number of people showed up wearing those creepy Purge-style masks. By midnight, the party had taken on that strange quality that massive parties sometimes develop. The kind where you stop recognizing everyone. At first, you know every face, then friends bring friends. Those friends bring more friends. Eventually, you're surrounded by strangers and have no idea when they arrived. The costumes made it even harder. Half the people there were hiding behind masks. The other half were too drunk to identify anyway. Logan didn't care. If someone showed up, they got let in. I lost track of how many people were there. Honestly, I couldn't have given you an accurate estimate if my life depended on it. 100? Maybe more. The entire house felt alive. Hours later, I found myself standing on the back deck, entertaining a small crowd with increasingly exaggerated stories from college. I was definitely drunk. Not blackout drunk, just drunk enough to think I was much funnier than I actually was. In the middle of one story, I glanced toward the house. That's when I noticed her. A girl standing just inside the sliding glass door. At first, there wasn't anything particularly strange about her. She was wearing one of those elegant masquerade masks you'd see at a formal ball, black and gold from what I could tell. The mask stood out because most people had gone with cheap Halloween costumes. Hers actually looked convincing, expensive even. She was holding a red plastic cup and standing completely alone, not talking to anyone, not dancing, just watching. For some reason, I got the distinct feeling she was looking directly at me. I paused in the middle of my story. She didn't look away. The longer I looked, the more it felt like she had been standing there for a while. Maybe even listening. I gave a small wave. She waved back. The gesture seemed perfectly normal, but something about it felt oddly deliberate, like she'd been waiting for me to notice her. That thought sounds ridiculous now, but it's honestly what crossed my mind at the time. I turned to the people standing nearby. Who is that? Nobody knew. A few people glanced over their shoulders. Most just shrugged. One guy joked that she was probably somebody's ex looking for trouble. That got a laugh, and I decided I'd just go introduce myself. So I headed inside. The second she noticed me approaching, she turned and walked deeper into the house. Not quickly, not like she was trying to escape, just calmly, almost casually. For some reason, that made me even more curious. I followed her through the doorway. A few seconds couldn't have passed between seeing her and entering the house myself. Yet when I got inside, She was gone. Completely gone. I scanned the room. Nothing. I checked the kitchen. Nothing. The hallway. The living room. Nothing. The house was crowded, but not crowded enough for someone wearing a distinctive masquerade mask to simply vanish. I remember standing there for a moment, feeling oddly confused. Not scared, not yet, just puzzled. I convinced myself she'd slipped into another room while I wasn't paying attention. It was the only explanation that made sense. Still, as I headed back toward the party, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that she had wanted me to follow her. And for the first time that night, despite all the noise and laughter surrounding me, I felt a small knot of unease settle in my stomach. At first, I wasn't sure what to make of the whole thing. Part of me wondered if she was trying to get my attention. Another part of me figured I was probably reading too much into it. The last thing I wanted was to be that guy. The drunk idiot who mistakes basic friendliness for flirting and spends the rest of the night making someone uncomfortable. So I let it go. At least I tried to. I went back outside and rejoined the party. But every few minutes, I found myself looking around for her, scanning the crowd, checking the windows, looking toward the pool, anywhere I thought she might be. I never saw her. Hours passed. The party got louder. People got drunker. The bonfire grew larger. Eventually, I stopped actively looking. Then I saw her again. I had just jumped into the pool with my hockey mask still on because, at that point in the night, it seemed like a completely reasonable thing to do. While treading water, I happened to glance toward the back of the property. There she was, walking alone across the yard. The sight of that gold mask immediately caught my attention. Logan's property stretched far beyond the house. There was no fence, just a massive open lawn that eventually gave way to a tree line. Beyond that was a small patch of forest, and that's exactly where she was heading, toward the trees. I called out to her. At least I tried. The problem was that I had no idea who she was. I couldn't exactly shout her name. So I ended up yelling things that probably sounded ridiculous. Hey, wait, gold mask. Real smooth. If she heard me, she didn't react. She kept walking until she reached the edge of the woods. Then she stopped. Slowly, she turned around. Even from that distance, I could see the gold mask reflecting the light from the house. And then she waved, directly at me. I actually looked behind myself to make sure. There wasn't anyone else standing there. It was me. She was definitely waving at me. Then she made a small gesture, a beckoning motion. Follow me. I didn't hesitate, not even for a second. Looking back, that's probably the part that should embarrass me the most. A mysterious girl in a mask gestures toward the woods, and my immediate reaction is to sprint after her. No hesitation, no questions. Just pure stupidity powered by confidence and alcohol. I climbed out of the pool and ran toward the tree line. By the time I reached it, she was gone. The distance had been farther than it looked. To give you an idea, the music that had been deafening beside the pool was barely audible once I reached the trees. The party suddenly felt very far away. I stood there catching my breath. The woods were dark, darker than they should have been. The moon provided enough light to outline the trees, but not enough to see very far between them. Hello? I called. No answer. Are you there? Still nothing. I wasn't trying to be creepy. Even though she'd motioned for me to follow her, I felt strangely self-conscious standing there, calling into the darkness. I searched for any sign of her. Mostly I looked for the reflection of the gold mask. It had been impossible to miss from across the yard. Now there was nothing. After a couple of minutes, my excitement started giving way to common sense. I was freezing. When I jumped out of the pool, I'd never bothered drying off or grabbing my clothes. I was standing in the middle of the night wearing nothing but a soaked swimsuit and a cheap plastic hockey mask. I remember laughing at myself. This whole thing was ridiculous. I finally decided to head back. As I turned around, a voice drifted from the darkness. Soft, almost gentle. "Don't go back yet." I froze. A second later, she added, "Come find me first." That was all it took. My common sense immediately packed its bags and left. I turned back toward the woods. "I can't see you," I called. For a moment, there was only silence. Then I heard a branch snap somewhere to my left. I turned instinctively, but her voice came from my right. "I'm over here." Something about that unsettled me. Not enough to leave, just enough to notice. I remember wondering how she was moving around so quickly without me seeing her. But every time I started questioning it, she'd say something playful and my attention would shift. She teased me, said I looked cold, said she could warm me up. I know how pathetic that sounds. Trust me, it worked anyway. I followed the sound of her voice deeper into the trees. Only a few steps in, my foot struck something. I looked down. Her mask. The gold masquerade mask was lying on the ground. For some reason, seeing it there made the situation feel more real, like I wasn't imagining any of this. I picked it up. Up close, it looked even nicer than I'd thought. The gold detailing reflected what little moonlight filtered through the branches. I called out that I had found it. No answer. Just silence. Then her voice again. Closer this time. I walked farther into the woods. By then, I had become completely invested in whatever strange game we were playing. I'd forgotten how cold I was. Forgotten about the party. Forgotten about my friends. The rest of the world seemed far away. Then I finally saw her. She was standing among the trees only a short distance ahead, maybe 15 feet away. Relief washed over me immediately. At least now I knew she was real. The darkness made it difficult to see details. I could make out a white tank top, black shorts, long dark hair hanging down over her face. She stood completely still. My brilliant opening line was, "I found your mask." She laughed softly, a quiet, pleasant laugh. "Thank you," she said. Then she asked if I could bring it to her. I started walking closer. She didn't move, not even a little. She didn't reach out, didn't step forward, just stood there waiting. The closer I got, the stranger that felt. Her head remained lowered. Her hair continued covering most of her face. I remember thinking that I still hadn't actually seen what she looked like. Not once, even after all this. When I was only a few feet away, I extended the mask toward her. "By the way," I said, "my name's Kip." For the first time, she reacted immediately. Without lifting her head, she said, "I know who you are." The moment I heard those words, something shifted inside me. The voice suddenly felt familiar. Not because I'd been talking to her all night, because I'd heard it before. Somewhere, at some other time. The recognition hit me instantly. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't place it. And standing there in the darkness, with her face still hidden behind a curtain of hair, that realization made me far more uncomfortable than I wanted to admit. When she said she knew who I was, my first thought was that she had to be someone from high school. Who else could it be? I was only a few inches away from her now. Slowly, she lifted her head. For a second, My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. Then recognition hit me. I knew her. Not well, but I knew her. She was a friend of a girl I'd briefly dated during my first year of college. The realization made absolutely no sense. My college was 8 hours away. 8 hours? What was she doing here? Before I could even ask, she took a small step backward. At that exact moment, I heard branches snap somewhere to my left. The sound immediately pulled my attention away from her. Instinctively, I turned. And that's when everything fell apart. A figure exploded out of the darkness. My ex. She was charging directly at me. In both hands, she held a metal baseball bat. For a split second, I couldn't even react because my brain refused to accept what I was seeing. Then she swung. The bat cut through the air where my head had been less than a second earlier. I dove sideways without thinking. The swing missed me by inches. I hit the ground hard. Before I could even fully process what had happened, I heard her scream. Not yell, not shout. Scream. There was a level of anger in her voice that still makes me uncomfortable to think about. I looked up just in time to see her raise the bat again. Another swing. This one came straight down. I scrambled backward as fast as I could. The bat slammed into the ground where I had just been. That was enough. I didn't try talking. I didn't ask questions. I didn't stay to figure out what was happening. I ran. To this day, I don't think I've ever run faster in my life. Branches slapped against my arms and face as I sprinted through the woods. Behind me, I could hear shouting, but I never turned around. I was terrified that if I looked back, I'd lose a step. And one step felt like the difference between getting away and not getting away. The moment I reached the edge of the yard, I started screaming. There are people in the woods. The music stopped. Conversations died instantly. People turned toward me. I must have looked insane. I was soaked from the pool, covered in dirt, wearing nothing but swim trunks and a cheap hockey mask hanging around my neck. I could barely get the words out. My entire body was shaking, partly from the cold, mostly from adrenaline. The party effectively ended right there. Nobody was interested in drinking after seeing the state I was in. Logan started forcing people to leave. Within an hour, the house had mostly emptied out except for a handful of close friends who were staying overnight. The one thing that frustrated me was that Logan refused to call the police. His reasoning was simple. If the police showed up, questions would be asked. Questions about the party. Questions about underage drinking. Questions his parents definitely wouldn't appreciate. At the time, I was angry. Looking back, I understand why he was worried. But part of me still wishes we had made that call. I clearly wasn't in any condition to drive home. So I stayed. And honestly, it was one of the longest nights of my life. I made Logan check every door and every window lock in the house. Then I checked them again myself, over and over. The entire night I kept finding excuses to look out the back windows. The tree line sat in the distance like a black wall. I kept imagining I saw movement, a silhouette, a person standing among the trees. But it was impossible to tell. The woods were too dark. The distance was too great. Every shadow looked suspicious. Every shape looked human. By morning, I was mentally exhausted. The second the sun started coming up, I threw my things in my car and left. The drive home gave me plenty of time to think. What kept replaying in my head wasn't the bat. It was the planning. The fact that someone had driven 8 hours. The fact that they had coordinated with another person. The fact that they had hidden in the woods waiting for me. That's what really bothered me. The attack felt personal, prepared, deliberate, and I couldn't stop asking myself why. My relationship with my ex had lasted only a few weeks. That's it. I ended things because the relationship felt unhealthy. She constantly wanted access to my phone, my emails, my messages. If I was a few minutes late getting back to my dorm, she'd immediately want an explanation. Sometimes I'd return from class and find her already waiting in my room. At first, I ignored the warning signs. Then eventually, I realized the relationship was moving far too fast and becoming far too intense. So I ended it. At the time, I considered it a relatively harmless breakup. Apparently, she didn't. For the rest of that summer, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. Every crowded parking lot, every grocery store, every party. If I saw someone who vaguely resembled her, my pulse would jump. Part of me was always waiting to see her again. Thankfully, I never did. Something else changed too. After that night, partying lost a lot of its appeal. So did heavy drinking. When you've spent a night wondering how close you came to getting hit in the head with a metal bat, a lot of things suddenly feel less important. In a strange way, that experience forced me to grow up faster than I otherwise would have. As far as I know, she never returned to that college after the summer ended. For a while, I occasionally checked her social media, mostly out of curiosity and concern. Eventually, those accounts disappeared too. I've never seen her since. And honestly, I hope I never do. Over the years, I've thought a lot about that night. Not because I still understand it, because I don't. I can't imagine what kind of thought process leads someone to drive 8 hours, recruit another person, and wait in the woods hoping to confront someone they dated for a few weeks. Maybe that's why it still unsettles me. Not because it was supernatural, because it was real. People often say to be careful what you say to others because you never know what someone might be going through. I think there's truth in that. But I also think some people carry pain, anger, or obsession in ways that are impossible to predict.